Since we last talked, the Orioles claimed an infielder off waivers. They showed some interest in an old friend in free agency, made some international signings, and released some minor leaguers. And we'll get to it all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Monday, January 20th, 2025, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb, and coming up on today's episode, we're going to run through some Orioles news and notes. We're going to talk about Jacob Amaya, the former top prospect infielder being claimed off waivers by the Orioles. We're going to chat about Tanner Scott, who signed with the Dodgers over the weekend, but reportedly the Orioles were in it all the way until the end. And then we'll discuss a bit about international signings, Roki Sasaki going to the Dodgers, and the Orioles releasing a chunk of minor league players. But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by FanDuel. From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started today. So I guess for better or for worse, and a little bit for worse, at least the feeling right now, it is officially baseball season and officially Orioles season in the city of Baltimore. If you are coming back to the Locked On Orioles podcast today for the first time in a while, we welcome you back. We are less than a month away from pitchers and catchers reporting to Sarasota for Orioles spring training. That baseball season is quickly approaching, and we are really at this point, just under 2 months away from opening day just over 2 months away, I should say, from opening day for the Orioles. So let's get to a little news roundup from the last couple of days involving some Orioles moves. And we start with the Orioles making another waiver claim, as they have claimed infielder Jacob Amaya off waivers from the Chicago White Sox. They had a full 40-man roster, and Roansy Contreras, which we'll get to in a moment, was DFA'd to make room. Now, who is Jacob Amaya? Well, he is a 26-year-old shortstop, right-handed hitter who is not the biggest guy in the world, listed about 5'10", 180 pounds, who the Dodgers selected in the 11th round of the 2017 MLB draft out of high school. Now, 11th rounder, not necessarily going to be your top prospect, but he had a whole lot of helium coming up through the Dodgers minor league system. He had some fantastic offensive years, going through high A and up to double A even in 2022, had a really good campaign there, got himself to triple A at age 23, and he looked primed to get himself to the big leagues in the 2023 season had he stayed with the Dodgers, but that did not happen. He was traded to the Marlins in the offseason between 2022 and 2023 in the Miguel Rojas trade. Rojas, who is still one of the shortstops on the Dodgers roster. And he ended up going to Miami, and he began the year in AAA there, and he was kind of fine. Played basically a full season in AAA, 128 games, had an 89 WRC plus, hit 252, walked a lot, didn't strike out a lot. He did pop 15 home runs. It was kind of the Jacob Amaya, maybe not top percentage of what he can do, but it was most of what he had been graded out as a prospect. Now, even going into 2024, he still had prospect status because he did make his major league debut with the Marlins in 2023, but he only played in 4 games. He had 9 plate appearances. He drove in a couple of runs. He really didn't do all that much when he got to the big leagues, but the next April, before heading into his second season, where potentially he could have earned a roster spot for longer with Miami, he was traded to the Houston Astros as Miami got right-handed pitcher Valente Biazzo back in the deal. And for Amaya, although he was going to a better organization, he was in a spot for much less playing time. If Amaya had been in Miami all this year, he might have got, 200, 300, 400 plate appearances with the amount of players they traded this season. Instead, he went to the Astros, and he ended up appearing for Houston in one big league game and getting one plate appearance. Now, he was in AAA for 73 games and didn't fare so well. Had a 65 WRC plus /223, 313, 336 with Houston's AAA club. Still had a really high 11% walk rate, but his 24.1% strikeout rate was the highest of his minor league career. Things started to look a little different there. And he also had a 24% swing and miss rate in AAA, also the highest of his career. But he also did hit the ball much harder. Amaya, kind of coming up through the later part of the system, was not the biggest power threat. If you look at his latest prospect report, when he was coming into the season, ranked as the Astros' number 14 prospect via FanGraphs, that was a 40 future value prospect. In the 20 to 80 scale, he had a 55 hit tool, which is really good, 55 run, and 50 field. What that tells you is he has a good feel for making contact. He plays shortstop really well. He could play second base and other positions, and he runs really well. That's all good things. But on the 20 to 80 scale, he had 30 game power rated by Eric Longenhagen at FanGraphs. Basically means, hey, he can make contact, but he's not really going to hit the ball out of the ballpark a lot. Now, he's played a lot of shortstop, second base, and third base. He's versatile defensively and good defensively in the infield. And FanGraphs describes him as a prospect with a short swing, a good batter's eye, really good bat-to-ball skills, a great defensive infielder, good speed, but at this point, basically no power at the plate. So he's a hit-first, defense-first, kind of slap-hitting infielder that at most in his career is probably not going to be more than a utility guy at the big league level. But the interesting thing that he did in AAA this year with Houston and others, that he started to hit the ball harder, had a 40.8% hard hit rate in AAA this season. He was, in the low to mid 30s throughout his career in hard hit rate, and then jumped it up to almost 41%. Now, it's different when you're facing AAA pitching. We know AAA pitching is much, much worse than big league pitching. But if you're putting about a 41% hard hit rate into major league perspective, those are the hard hit rates of guys like Josh Naylor and Jazz Chisholm, two really, really good hitters in Major League Baseball. So you can really play with a 41% hard hit rate. That's kind of different than Amaya had done in the past. And it could have been a scenario where Amaya saw, hey, I was a top prospect, right? At one point, he was ranked number 119 in the FanGraphs overall rankings in MLB. That was going into the 2021 season. So FanGraphs always ranks more than 100 players in their quote-unquote top 100 prospects, but he was a serious ranked prospect. But as time went on, he maybe starts to realize, hey, my game is not power focused. I don't have the ceiling I thought I once did as a big leaguer. And he changed a bit about his swing. Now, he gave up some of his contact skills. He swung and missed more. He struck out more, but he started to hit the ball harder. Now, unfortunately, it didn't lead to a lot of success. Again, it was still a 65 WRC plus, a 223 batting average, a 336 slugging. It's not like he was crushing the ball all over the field. He still only hit 5 home runs. But it is an indicator that although it didn't mean immediate success, it's an indicator that a former prospect at age 26 is willing to change, willing to take teaching, willing to adjust things on the fly to still make himself at some point a big league player. And while a lot of the skills are important, also being teachable, being moldable is also an important thing to have as a baseball player when you're not, a number one absolute stud that's, just by looking at him play is going to be in the big leagues for a long time. When you're in a spot where you need to change to make a roster, if you're willing to do it, teams like that, and the Orioles like that as well. So it's something to consider. Now, he only played that one game with the Astros. They ended up DFAing him in August, and he was claimed by the White Sox. And that was a good sign for Amaya because although the White Sox stink, you're going to get some playing time if you're on the White Sox in August and September. And he did at least get a little bit of that because while he had played 4 games in the big leagues in Miami in 2023, 1 game with Houston in 2024, he got at least a mini big league shot. 24 games with the White Sox in August and September. Now, it was 72 plate appearances, right? This is a super small sample size. He did nothing with that sample size. He hit 176, 222, 191 for a 17 WRC plus with the White Sox. His walk rate fell to 6%. He had a 39% strikeout rate. It went about as poorly as it could have gone for Jacob Amaya in his first anything close to a real test in the big leagues. Now, again, 24 games, yes, but he had only come in with 5 games of big league experience. So it's only 29 games in the major leagues. It is 81 big league plate appearances in his career. That is a crazy, crazy small sample size for Amaya. So you just kind of have to look at it and say, can he change? And he's shown, at least in AAA, that he's willing to do it. So the question is, okay, why did the Orioles claim a guy who was DFA'd by the Chicago White Sox, maybe the worst team in Major League Baseball? Well, first of all, he gives them another defense-first middle infielder with bat control who can play in AAA. And the Orioles like those guys. They've signed a couple in Vimael Machine and Franklin Barreto and some other guys, Jordan Adams, this offseason. They can kind of fill up the depth in AAA Norfolk because a lot of their top prospects have been either traded or are now in the big leagues for the O's, and they have much less depth at the AAA level than they've had for like the past 5 years or so. So they need to fill in some more of these spots. The Orioles love a former top prospect who really never had that bat come around, but is still young, and with Amaya is still making improvements. Now, even with the advanced hard hit rates this year, I still don't think he's ever truly going to hit for power, but I think he can hit the ball a little harder and be a little more productive as he moves forward. And he's already a really good runner and a really good defensive middle infielder. So he has that floor as a player, which is really nice to lock in first and foremost, knowing, hey, we've only really got to work with the bat. This is still a usable player, at least at the AAA level with those skills. And I think the Orioles hope, like, hey, if we can combine the contact skills with hitting the ball a little bit harder, they hope he could pop as like a good utility infielder at the big leagues who has way more team control. Now, unfortunately, he is now out of options. That was the big reason why he was DFA'd by the White Sox this offseason, is because he is out of minor league options for the first time this year, which means, if he's in camp with the Orioles and he doesn't make the team, they can't just send him to AAA without pushing him through waivers first. And because he is a former top prospect at 26, chances are some bad team would try to claim him on waivers and get him in their organization. Now, from the Orioles' perspective, he's probably going to get DFA'd at some point later this offseason. Quite frankly, the next move the Orioles make to add a player to the 40-man roster, it might be Jacob Amaya, who's the guy who's DFA'd to make room, because they're going to try to do with him what they did with Livan Soto earlier this offseason. DFA'd him. He cleared waivers. He remained in the organization. What they're trying to do with Roansy Contreras right now, where the Orioles claim a player, and they're very low on the waiver wire because they've had good records. They've gone to the playoffs. So they're lower on the waiver list. So they know, hey, we were able to claim this player. That means none of the, let's say, 24 teams ahead of us wanted this player. So we got him. In theory, if we then put him on waivers in 2 or 3 days, he will clear those same 24 teams. And then there's only 5 or 6 teams beyond us he has to also clear. If that happens as well, chances are it will, because the better the team, the less likely they are to claim a player that's not a slam dunk starter at this point. Then he can clear waivers and stay in the Orioles organization in AAA off the 40-man roster, and the O's can work with him. They've done it with plenty of players. The most successful one was Ryan O'Hearn in the offseason before 2023. They did that exact thing with him, and they're going to try to do it with Amaya. And if they can do that, and if they can work with him in AAA Norfolk this season, maybe by, let's say 2026 or even late this year, Amaya is showing that he has the skills to be a good utility infielder with way more team control, because he's not going to beat out Ramon Arias or Jorge Mateo for a roster spot this season. But Arias and Mateo are getting pretty close to hitting free agency, while as Jacob Amaya, he's not going to be a free agent until 2030 or beyond at this point if he gets to the big leagues. So if you can get Amaya at least to a Mateo level, you can get a cheaper replacement with way more team control. And that's a nice thing to have. And if it doesn't work out, he gives you some AAA depth this season, and you move on after that. Again, another low risk, potentially not the highest reward, but some reward built in there as well. And I mentioned the claiming and the DFAing very quickly. It's exactly what the Orioles just did with Roansy Contreras, right-handed reliever who they claimed off waivers last week. They DFA'd him to make room for Jacob Amaya. And the Orioles hope the same thing. Hey, most of these teams passed on him already. If they all do now, we can keep him in AAA and work with Contreras, another former top prospect who is still in his mid to early 20s that the O's can still potentially work with and get something out of in 2025. But they did actually bring in Amaya. We'll see what he can potentially do for the O's this season. They also had interest in another player who did sign elsewhere over the weekend. That's our old friend Tanner Scott. Now, if I let you guess what team he signed with, you might guess the Dodgers, and you'd be right because they've signed almost every player, it feels like, this offseason. But we'll talk about why the Orioles were interested in Scott and why it was probably an okay idea to not bring him in for the years and money he got in LA. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting. And right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. That's $300 to keep the action going. The FanDuel app is easy to navigate, and the variety of bets keeps every game exciting. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. No waiting around for your winnings. So whether you're betting on your favorite team or just looking to add some extra excitement to the playoffs, FanDuel has you covered. So just visit FanDuel.com to join today and get started with $300 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. So from Jacob Amaya, we move on to Tanner Scott, who officially over the weekend signed a 4-year, $72 million deal with the Los Angeles Dodgers. Ho-hum, the Dodgers signed another player for way too much money. Guess what? There's a signing bonus. Guess what? There's deferred money. They're kind of breaking the laws of Major League Baseball at this point. It's going to be really interesting to see how this all plays out. But the Dodgers basically have the wherewithal to sign any player at this point, and they brought in Tanner Scott for the third biggest contract for a relief pitcher in Major League history. And this is not just interesting because Scott, of course, was drafted by the Orioles and began his career with the O's until they traded him a couple of years ago. But Andy Koska of the Baltimore Banner also reported over the weekend, after Scott had signed with the Dodgers, that the Orioles were engaged in talks with Tanner Scott all the way up until the end, all the way up until he signed with LA, but just didn't want to go the 4 years. And there were also talks to teams like the Red Sox and the Blue Jays and others were engaged with Tanner Scott. But there was a report from Chris Cotillo of Mass Live, who covers the Red Sox over there, who also said the same thing about the Red Sox. They were interested. They just were not willing to go up to 4 years for Tanner Scott. And I know this falls into another we tried category. But for this one, I am totally on board with the Orioles not giving 4 years, and you'd have to outspend the Dodgers, so it probably would have took 4 years, $80 million to Tanner Scott. I'm good. Some of it is because we've already seen Tanner Scott in an Oriole uniform, and although he is a very different pitcher now than he was in Baltimore, there's some of that there. And the other part is just, it's not generally smart to give 4 years, close to $100 million to relief pitchers. And I get that Tanner Scott has been one of the best relievers in baseball over the past couple of years, but just, to me, it's not worth it. And I know I've had the conversation about, the Orioles thinking it's not worth it to give 5-6 years to a starting pitcher. And at some point, you just have to pony up and do it to make your team better, even if it might not be the smart thing. When it comes to relief pitchers, this is where I'm at the point where it's like, I'm good. I'm good on that. And I know I talked about how, the Orioles almost signed Jeff Hoffman, a reliever, to a 3-year, $40 million deal until the physical fell through. But as I talked about, I think the Orioles' plan for that deal was, you're going to be a reliever this year, and then in the last 2 years of the deal, we're going to turn you into a starter. And that is why the Orioles were willing to offer that contract to Hoffman. For Tanner Scott, I don't think he's going to be turned into a starter at any point. This is a reliever profile who's going to stay as a reliever. And relievers are so volatile. We know pitching injuries crop up insanely. And the Orioles, among many other teams, have shown over the past few years that it's not necessarily easy, but you can build a bullpen without giving out big-time free agent deals to get relievers. Like, let's look at the Orioles, which I think the Orioles are going to have their best bullpen in a few years coming up this year. Let's look at how they built this bullpen. Albert Suarez, minor league signing, who's probably going to move from the rotation to the bullpen this year. Keegan Aiken, former second-round pick by the Orioles years ago, was a starter, converted into a reliever. Seranthony Dominguez came over in a trade for Austin Hayes. The Orioles kind of had no use for anymore. Gregory Soto came over in a trade as well last offseason. You continue to look through this bullpen. Cionel Perez came over on waivers for the Orioles. Yennier Cano was a piece of a 4-player deal from Jorge Lopez when he was basically a nothing arm for the Twins back then. Felix Bautista was a minor league signing when he was a teenager, and they built him up throughout the system to turn him into one of the most dominant closers in the league. And really the only guy they've given any money to in this bullpen is Andrew Kittredge, and that was a 1 year cheap $10 million deal to bring him in to get a veteran piece. And they've built what I think is going to be a top 10 bullpen in the major leagues this year. I think the Orioles have really done a good job with this relief corps, and none of those guys, only one of them is a free agent signing, and it's a 1 year, very low risk deal. Like, teams have shown you can build bullpens this way. Now, when you're the Dodgers and you have unlimited funds, you can give out 4 years, $72 million for Tanner Scott, and don't think about it and know he makes your bullpen better. But even if you're the Orioles with this much expanded money, much expanded payroll, I'm not on board with giving any relievers 4 years, $72 million. Like, even as good as Tanner Scott has been, right? He came up with the Orioles, debuted in 2017. 2018, he showed the strikeout stuff. He also had a 5.40 ERA. 2019, the ERA came down, but the walks were insane that year. Remember, he posted a 16% walk rate. 2020 was a good season. He had a 1.31 ERA, but was still walking 12% of batters. 2021, he walked 15% of batters with his strikeout rate going down. His ERA was at 5.17, and the Orioles were just kind of done with the walks. Like, it was a fastball from the left side at 96, 97. They loved that, a wipeout slider, but just tired of watching the walks. They ended up dealing him right before opening day 2022, along with Cole Salser to the Marlins. They got Kevin Guerrero and Antonio Velez back. Those guys haven't turned into much, but they also got a comp pick in which they took Judd Fabian. He is still in the organization, so kind of the last guy holding on from that deal. But many thought it was just time to move away. And since then, he's been great. I mean, in Miami in 2022, the walk issues got even worse, you could argue, back to 16%. But then in 2023 in Miami, he figured out how to throw strikes. He had a 2.31 ERA that season in 74 games, picked up 12 saves, and he got his walk rate down to 8%, down to league average. Now, it spiked back up a bit this year with the Marlins and the Padres, but you look at his baseball savant page, and it's, average exit velocity was the lowest in baseball. Hard hit rate, 28%, one of the lowest in baseball. Chase rate high, whiff rate high, barrel rate very low, ground ball rate high. Like, he was a dominant reliever just throwing fastball, slider, and the stuff being so good. Like, if he were on the Orioles, he would be one of the best setup man in baseball behind Felix Bautista and would help you in the closer role until you know if Bautista is ready to go back-to-backs as the O's kind of ease him into this year. I'm not saying he wouldn't be a good fit on this Orioles team. He absolutely would. But Tanner Scott is 30 years old, and you're giving a 30-year-old reliever 4 years and $72 million. Just with the volatility of that position, the injury issues, the walk issues Scott has had, and just the history with the Orioles and how bad it got at times for Tanner Scott, I'm good. And maybe I'll be wrong, and maybe Scott will be just as dominant for the next 4 years for the Dodgers. That's a possibility, but I'm good on Tanner Scott. I will say the best thing to come out of this news that the Orioles were engaged is that they clearly still have money to spend. Now, obviously, the Orioles weren't interested in a 4-year deal, but I could see the Orioles, maybe offered him 2 years and 30 to 40 million and said, hey, do you want to make a good amount of money for the next 2 years in the back end of our bullpen? And maybe he said no. But if the Orioles are willing to do that, that means, hey, they've gotten their payroll up to 15th in baseball. There's still openings there to spend more money this offseason. What that tells me is, hey, if they want to go get a pitcher who's paid $15 to $20 million next year, they still have that opening to make that trade and add that to their payroll as well. It is nice to know that here on January 20th, they are still willing to move the payroll forward. I know Tanner Scott's great. It's just not something I would have been super interested in with his history with the Orioles and just the general point of relievers don't really work out when you give them these big money deals. Happy for him that he got his money with the Dodgers. But 2 years, fine. Bring him in. 4 years, $72 million. Not totally on board with that potentially being the case. But one more big thing to get to here on today's episode. Got some minor league news. International signings, players coming into the system, but that generally means players leaving the system as well. We'll get to all that to finish off the show coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by Rocket Money. Did Rocket Money help you find any subscriptions you forgot about or that you were paying for twice? Well, it definitely happened to me. I had a few subscriptions I didn't even realize I was still paying for, and Rocket Money made it so easy to track them all down. It's like having a personal assistant for your finances. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps you find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills so you can grow your savings. It brings everything together in one place, whether it's subscriptions, your spending habits, or even the goals you want to hit this year. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all of the app's premium features. And the best thing about Rocket Money is I can use it to cancel services I'm not using anymore, and I don't want to make a phone call to cancel those things. Rocket Money can do it for you. So cancel your unwanted subscriptions and reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/lockedon today. That is rocketmoney.com/lockedon. One more time, it's rocketmoney.com/lockedon. So wanted to finish things off today with some minor league news, starting with the International Amateur signing period opening up last week on January 15th. And the Orioles announced the signing of 22 new players to their minor league system. Now, this is a process we've talked about a lot over the past week or two here on the show. A lot of this process is pretty messed up. Basically, how it works is teams go down to mainly the Dominican Republic and Venezuela, but also other countries as well. And they are scouting, recruiting players as young as sometimes 13 years old, generally 14 years old, and making handshake agreements with those players. Now, these handshake agreements are not allowed per MLB rules, but every single team does them, even though a player can't be signed until they turn 16. So you're talking about 1 to 2 years in advance, these teams are making handshake deals with players. Each team has a allocated pool of money that they can spend on these international amateur free agents. It used to be just a free-for-all. You could spend what you wanted. Now it's capped around $13 million total for each team to spread out and spend on players they want. You can trade for further bonus pool money, which we saw some teams do this year, but generally it's around $13 million. The Orioles ended up announcing that they brought in 22 players. Their biggest signing was José Peña, a shortstop out of the Dominican Republic, who was given a $1 million signing bonus by the Orioles. Generally, over the past few years, they've had some players who have pushed towards $2 million as their highest signing. Peña at $1 million was their lowest number one signing in a little while now, but I think they spread out the money a little bit more this year to get more players for a little more money than they have in the past. Of those 22 total players, 11 from the Dominican Republic, 6 from Venezuela, 4 from Cuba, and 1 from St. Thomas. 14 position players and 8 pitchers coming in. And I think really the other notable player is Ricardo Chirinos. Robinson Chirinos, his nephew, a catcher the Orioles signed for just over $100,000 in this class. Robinson, of course, the Orioles' new bench coach heading into 2025. But the O's also left about $1 million in their pool for late signings. Those could be used for really one of two things. One is, okay, the Dodgers, we know now, are getting Roki Sasaki because, of course, they were. It was all kind of a farce this entire time, and everybody pretty much knew, hey, he was going to the Dodgers all along, and that is what happened. But Sasaki, because of weird stuff with his posting and his age, was part of this international pool of players. The Dodgers have to use basically as much money as they can from that allotted $13 million to pay Sasaki's bonus to come to the Dodgers. And it's already happened that the Dodgers have basically cut out some other handshake deals they had with players to free up some more money. And that allowed some other teams like the Pirates and others to sign some of those players that previously had been understood that they'd be signing with the Dodgers. There's still a couple more players that could happen with. They could still be available. And the Orioles could use that $1 million to scoop up any of those guys. Or there's always some late signings. Sometimes it's Cuban players who defect from Cuba at odd times, and you aren't really able to be signed until that happens. That's how the Orioles got Cesar Prieto a couple of years ago. That's how they got Jordan Sanchez a couple of years ago, who's turned into a really interesting power-hitting outfielder who's moving up their system. Of course, Prieto got to AAA before he was traded to the Cardinals in the Jack Flaherty deal a couple of years ago. So the O's are saving $1 million. A lot of teams do this. The O's have done this a lot. When some interesting talents kind of leak out later in the year and they still have some money left over to sign those guys. But this was obviously a very weird international process. It's always kind of an issue. And, there's a question of should there be an international draft? There's a lot of good things, a lot of bad things that come with that as well. It's a very messed up system at this point. We know the Orioles weren't participating in this system until Mike Elias took over under Peter Angelos and Dan Duquette. It was mostly Angelos. The Orioles just said, for whatever reason, we are not participating in this. So they missed out on a lot of talent. So when Elias took over in November of 2018, the Orioles were way behind in the international process. And only now, really, are they starting to catch up. Because you think about 2 years in advance, you have these handshake deals done. So Elias takes over in 2019. Really, until 2021 is the first time he's able to sign any good players. And that's when the Orioles, of course, got Samuel Basallo, who's going to be knocking on the door of the big leagues in 2025. And since then, they've still been trying to build up these relationships with these agents and trainers and players in the Dominican Republic and other places, and are finally really catching up. And that's why we haven't seen any of those players get to the big leagues yet, because the O's were just so behind when Elias took over. But Sasaki threw a wrench into things. Of course, he signs with the Dodgers. At this point, it kind of is what it is, and we move on from that. A couple other things to get to. The Orioles, unfortunately, when you bring in a lot of players to the system with the new restrictions on minor league roster limits and the contraction of the minor leagues, it ends up meaning a lot of players get released as well. And the Orioles released 16 minor league players late last week. Most of them were players who never really made it out of rookie ball and were probably going to get released at some point. I would say there were 5 intriguing, notable names that got released. Wanted to run through them. 27-year-old Shane Fontana was released, a 23rd round pick, a round that doesn't even exist anymore, in Mike Elias' first draft in 2019. Got to AAA in 2022 and has been there ever since, but has never really hit at that level. Had just a 627 OPS in 73 games last year in Norfolk. He gets released. Hope the best for him moving forward. Isak De Leon, a 23-year-old infielder, was released. He was acquired in the Richard Blyer trade with the Marlins back in September of 2020, was originally a Marlins signing out of the Dominican Republic in 2018. Got to high A Aberdeen in 2022, but the bat has really stalled there, and he has never gotten to double A. He was injured for most of last year, was out in May for the rest of the year, only played 21 games last season, and his career kind of seemed to plateau here recently. 25-year-old right-handed pitcher Justin Showalter was released. He hadn't been with the organization for that long, was signed as an undrafted free agent out of James Madison back in July. He had a 2.67 ERA with 27 strikeouts in 27 innings in Delmarva, but the Orioles cut him loose. Graham Fireved, a right-handed pitcher, was released, 16th round pick in 2022 out of Virginia Tech. Spent all of the last 2 seasons in Aberdeen with ERAs over 5. He's always had good strikeout numbers, but in 41 2/3 innings last year, he walked 21% of batters. League average is 8%. That is an astronomical walk rate. The Orioles probably felt like this is something we can't fix, and they released Fireved. And finally, the last one, 24-year-old third baseman and outfielder Ryan Higgins, who was the Orioles' 9th round pick in 2021 out of Fresno State, was released as well. Hit really well back at high A this year and got the call up to double A Bowie for the first time, but then he hit just 194 in 76 games at double A. He's got huge power in his bat, but he posted a 34% strikeout rate in double A. 34% strikeout rate at the major leagues would lead the league. He did that in double A. That is a gigantic problem that the Orioles see probably only is going to get worse. Hopefully for him, he can catch on with another organization. But that'll do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll be back a little bit later this week, continuing our look at all the Orioles players from 2024, reviewing their seasons. Wanted to take a look at Grayson Rodriguez's season. Yes, it was injury shortened, but can he finally stay healthy and maybe be the ace the Orioles need in 2025? It's coming up on tomorrow's episode. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.